Well, at this point, I am going to turn things over to Devon to begin the didactic portion of our echo. Thanks, Devon.
Thank you, Margie. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming today. I just want to first say, I never let people do long introductions. Margie, I don't know how you got that extended introduction. When they asked me to send a brief bio, I didn't know. I would have sent you two sentences, Devon and from Dayton. So I appreciate everybody for hopping on. I am excited to speak with you all about clinical research and all of the different aspects of it. I'm going to share my screen now to get us on the road. A couple of things, and I appreciate those housekeeping rules. I like to set the table. I'm pretty open when I present, and you will find out as we go through the presentation some of the things that I do as far as research and working in the space of education about research. And so if there's a question, please feel free to raise your hand or to interrupt me. It is okay. I can't see everyone's screen. And so if you do have a question that's pressing, please feel free to interrupt me. Margie, I really appreciate you giving such a kind introduction. I found out things about myself I didn't remember. So no need to go over any the introductory information, but I do want to say or talk about any conflicts of interest. Number one, I do work at Case Western, but I'm also a volunteer and I help lead several committees at the Alzheimer's Association. And I'm also a member of the Cleveland Alzheimer's Disease Research Center's Minority Advisory Board, where I do help lead a couple committees there as well. And so as we move forward, please feel free if you have any questions about any of those organizations. But thank you all for taking the time. I want to go over our presentation objectives. Number one, we're going to talk about research myths and truths. This whole section will be housed from the book The Medical Apartheid, written by Ms. Harriet Washington. Thereafter, we're going to talk about why inclusion in clinical and observational studies matter. And thereafter, we're going to talk about a case study, if you will. We'll talk about our research and understanding Alzheimer's and dementia and why it is relevant to the previous two topics of research myths and inclusion in observational studies. And so as we move forward, please look forward to the different information that I offer. But I do want to say there's different branding throughout these presentations because I'm stringing together 4 different presentations that we give on a consistent basis in our communities. So the medical apartheid, right? This is a really important book to talk about because it talks about the history of medical experimentation on Black Americans. And I think we often talk about why is it relevant for us as a whole. And the reason is because these different examples of research and the unethical practice of research, they go far past the Black community. There's examples of these in all types of communities. And so I will be referencing some examples in other communities over the span of medical research here in the United States and in the Western discipline in general. So just a brief information about Ms. Harriet Washington. She is a medical ethics professor at Harvard University, and she wrote this book as an attempt to educate people about some of the darker sides of medical advancement and research. I think we often don't discuss how some of those advancements happened and how we got here, and some of the people who were not able to see the bright side of those advancements. And so one of the main things in her book that she talks about is the Tuskegee experiment, where in Tuskegee, Alabama, a public health service study subject receives an injection from a PHS physician. The men were not injected with syphilis, but they were administered injections and underwent other procedures that maintain the illusion that they were undergoing treatment for syphilis. And so this is one of the many examples in which you see vulnerable populations, whether it be a minority, a person who is a part of the federal government, such as a soldier, be the suspect or the subject of a research project without informed consent. So moving forward, I like to do a small timeline as we look at some of these things to understand, to get a deeper understanding of them. And so let's go to the top left. This gentleman, Mr. James M. Sims, MD, the father of American gynecology, right? This individual was a professor at the University of New York, and he had he's done over hundreds of practice procedures to understand different things about the practice of gynecology. And so over this time, what we know is that these procedures were done on patients without their consent. And so for all of the medical advancements that Dr. Sims may have found through his research, there's often no description or conversation about the individuals who may have been negatively impacted by his research ventures. Moving forward to the bottom left, the P.T. Barnum, the Circus King. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. To the top right, I apologize. Moving forward to P.T. Barnum, the Circus King. This is a picture of Miss Joyce Health. This is a picture of a woman who passed away. They considered her to be the mammy of George Washington. And so she was a slave of George Washington. And she has certain physical features. And so when she passed away, her body was a event where it had over 1,500 spectators come and attend. And so I like to bring this example up because it's not only for necessarily medical advancement that a lot of these research or these different viewings of bodies or different body parts happen. Sometimes it was over general interest as a social phenomenon. Moving forward, we have a picture to the bottom left of the University of Georgia's Medical College. These are all different students producing or conducting dissections, right? And this is really important to talk about because these dissections are on cadavers or bodies that they got from graveyards without consent from those family members or individuals. And so this was a very common practice between the 1800s and 1900s, where medical universities would go to different graveyards, or the medical students would go to different graveyards and take the cadavers, if you will, for procedures and dissections. And then moving to the last photo to the bottom right, during this period, you had a lot of focus on biology and genetics and how we could understand how to use the science behind biology and genetics to alter the way that individuals are born, their genetic structure, and ultimately the outcomes that they have in life. And so one of the things that they often did was conduct studies looking at physical features to see if different races were different as species or if biologically, how were they different? And so this example here is of an individual who was a slave from the Congo that was put on an exhibit with other individuals to show how racist physical features differ. And so this is another example about how research in its early forms was used as a way of classifying and understanding different race, genders, and creeds. Moving forward to the 1900s to 2000s, the first one that we have is to the top left, which is the Mississippi appendectomy, as is often referred to. And the woman in the picture is Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, a very famous civil rights leader. And this speech here is given as an advocacy for fair rights and voting. But she attributed her start in politics from her experience of a Mississippi appendectomy, which is a unconsented or forced sterilization that she experienced at the age of 19. Moving forward to number two, this is to the top right. This is the USA's Atomic Energy Commission and the University of California, San Francisco. And the woman in the picture is holding a picture of her husband who was injected with plutonium as a part of an atomic energy experiment. And so there was no process of informed consent. And as we know to this day, there was 19 individuals involved in this research project, but that was only verified if they had trace amounts of plutonium still in their bloodstream. So it may have been other individuals impacted by this research study and may have not been acknowledged. Moving forward to the bottom left, we have a picture of an individual who was a part of the Philadelphia Holmesburg prison experiments. These prison experiments were used to see how different pathogens and diseases impacted individuals in close quarters. And this is a very interesting one because it also goes into the crux of vulnerable populations and how in certain situations they can be used for experiments and people not be aware of it. And now to the last one, which is an individual with his doctor in the background. This was 2001. This man had a heart replacement surgery with a experimental device, and the doctor in the rear during the consent process promised certain things. And after the procedure was completed, 6 months after, the patient began to complain about all the things that they said would happen did not happen. And in fact, a lot of the things got worse. And so in 2001, this is seen as a very important case because in this new form or fashion of medical research, are we really making sure that the individuals conducting research for interventions are doing it ethically and are clear about the expectations that those patients should have? And so that is a brief history over some of the examples of how research has been done in the past. I think it's really important to go through history to set the table for where we're at now and where we could be in the future. So, oh, excuse me. Sorry. How did we get here, right? This is strange. Okay, it might have been. All right, I'm gonna stop messing with it. So there's actually to the left is supposed to say, how did we get here? But nonetheless, the question of how do we get here, as far as how did those things happen in those research examples where individuals were taken advantage of or not formally involved? And so there's multiple different elements to why these things were happening on such a large basis back then. And so number one, let's think about conflict of interest. And so, in the system that we have today, in comparison to the system in the past, the largest guarantor of federal or of research is federal grants, right? And so, one of the main reasons that is to make sure it's for the public benefit, and there is no conflict of interest from the findings of those research topics. But in the past, what typically happened was research was led by private industries. And so private industries, number one, didn't have quality standards or ethical standards they had to follow, right? And so for anyone that understands how things could happen, let's say as far as tobacco products and things of that nature, in the past, they were publishing fake reports saying that tobacco usage was healthy, right? And so that can be an example of conflict of interest. Moving forward to number two, data falsification. I have a real example of this. Recently, we had a scientist that was in the NIA that was doing research into Alzheimer's disease, and he had been found to have made false data changes and to have falsified certain data in reports. This was a huge finding because it shows that with all of the things on the line, all of the grant dollars, all of the people involved who are impacted by these chronic conditions, right? There's still something to, they have to come out with some result or some answer. And so in certain situations, we've seen scientists give false data. And it is a very important thing to think about and how that impacts what the findings are for research. Number three, non-disclosure of safety procedures. What this means is it's not clear communication of what is going to happen and how that patient will be kept safe throughout the entire experiment. Number four, authorship issues. And what I often attribute this is not enough transparency in who's involved in the publishing of the research. Every person who's involved must be on the bylines. But in certain situations, you see people who may be kept off or people who may be added for the sake of not being transparent. Number five, no informed consent. In the next slide or two slides from now, we're going to go through the complete definition of informed consent. But this is a process where sometimes if a person is not informed about what they're going through, how could they really say yes to what's happening? Number six, data fabrication. This is where they're making up the numbers, not falsifying data that's already been published or gathered, but making up numbers. Number six, image manipulation, which they can alter graphs or alter different specimens under microscopes. And then the last one, no permission for data/information usage. This goes far past medical research, as we're seeing today, right? Data is one of the key pieces of information that weaves everyone together. And so if we're using data that someone has not given permission to be used, that's unethical, right? And so these are some of the things that have caused those abuses in research in the past. Now, looking forward, where are we now, right? Where are we now? And so after all of these different research things like the Tuskegee experiments, the Holmes prison experiments, there started to be a response by government that says we need to create a structure that both private and public entities follow for research and medical accountability. And so these are some of those institutions that were created and that are widespread across the country, the 48 states, and also all colonies and things of that nature. So the first one, HIPAA. Everyone's familiar with HIPAA. HIPAA actually, when it was first passed, it was not in certain territories of the United States. Now this is across all 50 states and territories. But HIPAA is a very important step because what was happening, medical and pharmaceutical companies was buying information from the insurance companies. And so when HIPAA was passed, it prevented them from illegally sharing that data information that was given or that was gathered from medical experiences. Very important. Number two, consent forms. Consent forms, when we do our research and we go and visit a person, we have two copies. The copy that they sign and we take with us, and the copy that we leave with them so that they are able to refer to it later. Those consent forms should have every piece of the study that they're participating in involved in it. And then the CREC, right? These are all education tools that are used to keep researchers up to date on all things relevant to their study or the field of research in general. And then the last one, I think a lot of us have heard of institutional review boards, right? IRBs. These are essential. IRBs are typically made up of medical professionals, lawyers, and community members. And they go through different research studies that are proposed and they make sure that they're ethical. And so I'll give you all an example of what we do. For our study, we go into people's homes. And so one of the things that the IRB said that we had to do if we were going to go into people's homes and or work with people's families, which we do as well, we had to be trained on mandated reporting to see, notice, observe, and acknowledge elder abuse. And so that was the stipulation the IRB made us follow, right? And so institutions and systems like this work to make research more ethical and more inclusive. And they're really important. And I think that they have made great strides over the past 50, 60 years in making different changes to the culture of research. So just to go over it before we move forward to why inclusion matters in research. Number one, what is informed consent, right? We talked about consent forms. Informed consent is just not a signed piece of paper, but rather the process by which researchers inform the subject in detail of number one, what he or she proposes to do. Number two, why it is being proposed. Number three, what are some of the possible consequences? And number four, the permission of the subject. Number five, to continue to inform the subject of developments. And number six, the subject may withdraw from the experiment at any time. And so number five, we just got this passed from our IRB that if a person who goes through our study shows to have any cognitive decline, that we reach back out to them with the letter so that they can give it to their primary care physician. And so it's small things like that that brings that person into the study, makes them feel like they're a part of it. It gives them a deeper understanding of why the research is happening. So this is one of our study flyers, and this is just an example of what informed consent could look like. And so number one at the top, we're explaining what the research is. Number two, we're explaining the different qualifications for the research itself. I mean, this is just one of our studies. We have multiple. And then it explains what happens here. And one of the things is coercion is a really important topic. And so a lot of studies, they're not allowed to say how much a person, excuse me, how much a person would get if they do or partake in the research because they would consider that coercion. And so it doesn't have an amount, it just has the gift card. So things that are clearly titled and shows the information would be what you would consider informed consent. And this is just our service connection flyer. This is what we try to connect people to services. And so now moving forward to close out research, right? These are some of the things that people think of. When you mention research, this is what they think of, right? They just care about the numbers. It'll make me worse off, right? All medical researchers are untrustworthy. This won't benefit me. They don't really care about me. I'll be mistreated, right? And so all of you as students will encounter this to one degree or another as well. And so one of the things I often say about this is education first. Education first. People want to understand what research is, what the topic is of the concern. Education first helps break down those walls, those barriers of mistrust, where people think that this will make me worse off, or people just care about the numbers, or all medical researchers are untrustworthy. There's about building a rapport and a relationship that goes into people understanding why research is important, right? So before I go into why inclusion matters, is there any questions, thoughts, or concerns? No? Okay.
In the chat.
So I want to break down the differences in the different type of studies because I think there's often sometimes some misinformation about what studies are. And so there are typically, when people talk about studies, two different types. Number one, clinical research, and the other, observational research. So clinical research, it typically involves some type of intervention or new treatment or medication that is given to this patient. Number two, participants are assigned specific treatments or interventions, often randomized or in controlled trials. And number three, a clinical trial testing a new cancer drug to see if it works is better than the current standard treatment, right? That's an example of a clinical trial. As far as some in the field of Alzheimer's, I think a lot of people may have heard about different medications that have been now FDA approved. All of those had to go through clinical trials, and they all had certain quality standards and demographics they had to reach for it to become FDA approved. And then the second, observational studies, right? This is the type of studies that we're involved in. And there's not necessarily an intervention given to that person, but instead we're coming to get information. And sometimes it's either over a short period of time or a long period of time. And long period of time is called longitudinal studies. And so our study is a 5-year study where we come back to people every 2 years to get that information again because we set a baseline from our first visit. And so observational research, it typically does not have any intervention that's given to the person. We're just getting information for observational purposes. So just to recap, the key difference, research actively intervenes to test treatments, while observational research uses passive and behavioral research. So let me see. My notes went away. I'm sorry. Give me one moment. I had them at the bottom of my screen. I don't know where they went. It's okay. So, moving forward, when we think about clinical trials or observational studies, why is it important that inclusion happens, right? Why is it important that people of all different backgrounds are involved in research, right? Number one, treatments and medical advancements are effective for all populations and not just a limited group. There has been certain medications that have gone through processes in the past that did not ensure that it was tested on different types of people and have shown to be deleterious or have bad impacts on them. And so it's really important that you have a diverse sampling so that you are able to understand how that medication may react to different genetic sequences. Number two, differences in disease risk, treatment response, and side effects among different populations can be identified. And so an example of this can be blood pressure medications and the way that they may respond differently to African American patients as opposed to white patients, right? And then number three, research reflects the real world diversity of patients, leading to more accurate and equitable healthcare solutions. This is essential because you want a solution in context. If you give a solution that is out of context or not purported to the proportions or demographics of a community or a specific place, it typically is not as effective as it could be. And so, without inclusion, certain groups may be underrepresented, leading to biased results and treatments that may not work as well for everyone. Number two, historical mistrust or distrust in medical research, especially in marginalized communities, can persist, further limiting participation and healthcare benefits. And the last thing, policies and medical guidelines may not be comprehensive or effective for all communities. And so we have seen, and I don't want to speak to current politics, but we have seen a lot of progress in this space of making sure that people are included in research. And I personally believe that that progress will continue based off of some of the recent executive orders and things of that nature. Not much of our work has really changed as far as engaging communities, but it may have changed for other research studies. So why does a diverse ancestry sample matter? Right? Number one, understanding how different populations experience diseases, as some genetic variations make people more or less susceptible to certain conditions. I'm going to give an example for you all. There is a gene that Taiwanese people have. And so I think it's like 87% of Taiwanese people, and then it's a small percentage of South Korean people that stops them from being able to digest the chemicals in alcohol, which causes them to have certain skin responses, right? Without research and without understanding, we would have maybe thought that was a large swath of a demographic, or it may not have been as widespread as it is. And so diverse ancestry matters, even if it's involved with a specific community. Looking at multiple families and not just one group is really important. Identifying genetic markers are really good, or what they also call biomarkers. That's really important, and that typically happens with more diverse ancestries because you have a larger pool of genetic data. And then last, improving precision medicine by ensuring that treatments are tailored to individuals' genetic backgrounds. And so I know it's a little scary when I say this. With some of the advancements in technology, such as AI, we're seeing that if we have a genetic sample, we're able to apply medications and changes based off of those genetic samples, right? And so, to close out, a lack of diversity in research can lead to misdiagnoses, a delay in discovery of genetic factors, or it can mess up or strain the healthcare system, right? So, an example, many early studies on heart disease were based primarily on white male participants, leading to delays in recognizing how symptoms can present differently in women and people from diverse backgrounds. Um, I often say men are the most included in research, ironically. It has taken time for other individuals to feel comfortable with it because of the mistrust, including women. Historically, women have not felt comfortable participating in research because at one point in time, informed consent was not a part of the process. And so over time, it has gotten more open and inclusive to everyone, including women and other races. So moving forward, this is like I would consider our case study. I like to apply and make sure that people understand the idea behind clinical research, informed consent and talk about our study because we try to meet that standard that we spoke of. And so before I get into our study specifically, I just want to talk about overall what the Alzheimer's disease research space looks like, right? So number one, the NIH and the NIA supports various different studies focused on Alzheimer's disease in different domains, if you will. And so the first one is biomarker research, which means that we're looking at genetic material to see, is there any genes that are considered risk factors or risk genes? Number two, translational research infrastructure, which means integrating and translating those informations into making sure we have clear findings based off the different disciplines and fields. Number three, prevention and treatment research. And so that's how we're seeing some of those newest advancements in medications like Leqembi or Akinumab. Number four, population studies and precision medicine research. The population studies are how we're finding that women disproportionately develop Alzheimer's disease in comparison to men. African Americans are 2 times as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. Native Americans 2.5 times as likely. That all comes from that population studies and precision medicine research. Number five, caregiver care and caregiver support studies. These are important to understand how stress is impacting individuals who are caregivers and the individual who may have it. And last but not least, the disease mechanism studies. And this all focused on what does the disease itself look like and what does it do. So just a brief understanding on Alzheimer's and dementia. Um, as we know it, the brain is the central control system. Over 100 billion nerve cells or neurons create a branching network that help us create those memories, those feelings, those thoughts, those emotions, those urges, right? Those signals traveling through the brain are electric signals. And so we in ourselves have these different tech hubs in our own brain, right? And so what we know from Alzheimer's disease is it forms these plaques and tangles on those neurons, which over time causes those neurons to stop working properly, which result in changes in memory, behavior, and activities of daily life, or the ability to do activities of daily life. A lot of people would consider Alzheimer's a normal part of the aging process, but it is not. Dementia is a general term that describes problems with thinking and memory, while Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia, which I just mentioned is caused by those plaques and tangles on the brain. But I like to clarify, this is not a normal part of aging. And through research, we've been able to understand that a person has those plaques and tangles form on their brain, and they may not see changes in their behavior or memory until 10 years after. And that came from longitudinal studies that were viewing that person over years or over a set amount of time, gaining more insight. And so what we know from research is that a breakdown of the dementias, Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, right? And then you have vascular dementia. Vascular dementia is relevant to that connection between the brain and the heart, right? Then you have frontal temporal dementia, which impacts the frontal lobe. And then the last one, which is dementia with Lewy bodies, which is typically attributed to dementia that impacts the nervous system. And then last but not least, you have others. And I would consider those others to be mixed dementias. We're seeing individuals who have different causations of the dementia interacting with each other. And so when we think about the story of our health, I like to attribute risk factors as far as Alzheimer's and dementia. There's four. The first one is age, right? The older that a person gets, the higher risk they are for developing Alzheimer's and dementia. But these are the three other risk factors. Number one, genes and family history. We know that there's a genetic component to this. In fact, we know that there is risk genes that are associated with Alzheimer's and dementia. And our final slide will show some of our research that is shown about that. Number two, environment, right? We know that a person's access to fresh air, fresh water, fresh groceries, medical care, education, and access to employment has impacts on their quality of life and their outcomes. And then last but not least, lifestyle, right? What does that person eat? Does that person drink? All of these things are contributing factors to either protective factors or risk factors for Alzheimer's and dementia. And then these are some of those important things that we look for as a story of our health to understand the numbers and some of the things that may put a person at a higher risk. Number one, blood pressure. Number two, blood sugar, weight and BMI, and cholesterol. These are all different things that a doctor will look at when assessing a person for memory loss or dementia because they impact in different ways the health and the functioning of the brain. And this is just a quick, I like to offer this slide to think about. Research has proven that these 7 things have been shown to lower someone's risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. Moving forward, excuse me, I'm looking at some clinical treatments and things of that nature. I thought it would be important to talk about them. As we look at the grand scheme of medications for Alzheimer's specifically, the disease was found or discovered in 1906. We didn't get the first medication for Alzheimer's disease through clinical trials and approved through the FDA until 1996, and that was Aricept. And what you will see at the top is most of the medications that have been found for Alzheimer's and dementia or have been approved for Alzheimer's and dementia have been focused on treating symptoms, right? And so those are symptoms like agitation, changes in personality, things of that nature. It wasn't until recent discoveries that we found that they now target amyloids, and that was lecanemab or Kinumab. And so these different medications, all of them have been through the FDA approved treatment process as clinical trials to become medications for Alzheimer's and dementia. And one side note, in certain cases, individuals are not only prescribed these medications to address symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia. Sometimes they can be prescribed mood stabilizers, SSRIs, or antidepressants as well. So, moving forward to our last slide, I'd like to leave some time for questions. This is some of our research as an update. Now, when we think about genetics and Alzheimer's disease, we think about 2 different types of genes. Number one, risk genes. Number 2, deterministic genes. Risk gene, if a person is found to have whatever risk gene, they're at a higher risk for developing a condition. And then deterministic genes, if this person has this gene, they're at a definitive, it's for sure that they would get this condition. And an example of this is Huntington's disease. So for Alzheimer's and dementia, we have found a risk gene, and it's called APOE4, right? And so what we're finding is that this APOE4, if it's found in an individual, they may be at an increased rate or a risk for developing Alzheimer's and dementia. And so some of these different slides here, the one to the left, but APOB has different risks by different ancestries. What it's showing is that depending on the ancestral background, this is the odds ratio if a person may develop the Alzheimer's and dementia. And so what we're seeing is that Japanese, based off the APOE gene alone, have the highest risk and instance of it. And as you look down and go forward, our research, it focuses on any race, color, creed here in the United States, but it also does research in Africa. We have 9 sites in Africa at different universities. And so one of the things that we're finding, which is astonishing, Africans are at a far less risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia than their African American counterparts. And so when we speak to some of those risk factors, lifestyle, environment, what may have you, well, how do those impact outcomes, right? That's a really important question. And then moving to the right, when we think about protective variants, and so when we see APOE4, a gene typically has it's like a quarter. It has another side to it. And so sometimes those things can be called a variant. In other cases, it could be the same exact gene on front and back, right? And so what we're seeing is that in certain situations, individuals are developing protective variants because they have a large exposure of it in their ancestry. And so what we're seeing now is individuals are developing protective variants from APOE4. And so we are still working to understand how we can reduce the risk of APOE4 alleles in all people and backgrounds. But this is some of the research of recent. I would like to leave it here. I'm going to stop sharing. And I would love to take any questions or comments about research, about Alzheimer's, about the process of how we got here. I would love to talk about
At this point, you can unmute and just ask Devon.
it.
Is part of the high risk in Japanese people just because they live the longest? Like, does that control for life expectancy?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. Um, I want to say no. And the reason that I want to say no is it's not a normal part of the aging process. And just because Japanese people typically live longer or have a longer life expectancy, it's not guaranteed that they would develop Alzheimer's and dementia. I think it is and this is just that specific gene. Japanese people are not found to be at a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's and dementia. Individuals from Asian ancestries aren't found to have a higher risk. They just have a higher instance of APOE4. And so it's a really good question. Since APOE4 has been found, they've targeted other types of amyloids to discern their risk. And so it is still an evolving field to understand which genes are truly determinant and which ones are truly risk factors. Excuse me. That means I did a good job.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to share about any research that they have been involved with, or any family members who have been involved in any Alzheimer's research that you'd like to share with the group?
Is there anyone's family impacted by Alzheimer's and dementia on the call today? Sorry to hear, Sophia. Understood. One of the things, and so the Alzheimer's Association does a lot of work in advocacy and public policy. And so this is relevant to research because they recently helped get a state budget or a state bill passed that will help expand the access to biomarker testing. So more and more individuals will be able to see if they're at a higher risk based off of their genetic makeup. But as a precautionary tale, I want to say, when you do the genetic testing like biomarkers, I've seen it do more harm than good in certain individuals. Because when they are found to have APOE4, they're at a higher risk and they are at a higher level of paranoia. And so it's not necessarily mean that you are automatically going to get it. But biomarker testing and things of that nature, they have been there has not been a lot of access. And so with this new policy by 2026, more and more people will be able to at least see if they have any of those risk genes.
Devon, could you speak to what, having those biomarker tests done, is there any downside in terms of insurance and future care?
Very good question. That was what the entire bill was about, was making insurance pay for it. And so now insurance does pay for it, but you still have to go through the hoop of getting a referral. And so they have made it easier. But what I will say is for Alzheimer's or any type of cognitive related condition, there's typically three ways of getting a diagnosis. Number one, cognitive testing, right? Memory games or whatever type of test to assess someone's intellect. Number two, you have imaging like PET, MRI, CAT scans. Those are used to get different types of images on the brain. But number three is biomarkers. And so this makes it easier because those other forms of testing are more extensive and more expensive. And so we're hoping that the insurance companies will see this as a possible trade-off, that giving people more access to biomarkers may limit how much they have to do as far as, or have to pay out for PET scans and cognitive testing. I've seen families get 2 out of the 3. And I've seen other families go do all 3. And I've also seen families who have just been content with the cognitive testing and allowing a geriatric professional to give a specific diagnosis based off of their interactions with them and not going to the PET scans or imaging.
Any questions or comments?
I was just going to say, going down that line with along the biomarker line and getting it early or at risk, thinking about life insurance and in the state we're in, even health insurance in the future. I know a lot of people are hesitant to have that in their history with those factors in mind. So I know that there's some reluctance sometimes to even get the testing at an early stage.
Mm. Now, and this is, I don't know for sure, but I would figure HIPAA would prevent that from impacting their medical file, but maybe it doesn't. I never thought about if people had saw or had that access, would it impact their ability to get insurance policies? I never thought about that.
I know that it's a consideration in like the breast cancer realm, that if you have the information, as it stands now, you're to report that like in your quest for life insurance policies and things. So it's just an ethical issue around it that, it's kind of unfortunate, but.
Couldn't you argue though that that's a pre-existing condition? So like but that would probably have to be some sort of ruling. But yeah, that's like, I would say that's discriminatory.
Yeah. Yeah, but getting insurance coverage in an insurance policy, I don't know if they follow the same rules. One of the things I think is so unfortunate, we live in a country that runs off of capital, but we don't necessarily teach capital. And so knowing that having a pre-existing condition can be the difference between getting a certain coverage or a certain thing is crazy. And so, I think it kind of goes back to that conversation we're talking about with ethics and research in general. What are the ends to which we are doing these things for? Is it for the public benefit and for us to cure diseases? Or is it for us to sell more medication, to create more patients? We have to answer and wrestle with those questions on a consistent basis because these are people on a day-to-day basis who have to be either caregivers or impacted with these conditions, For researchers and for medical professionals. It's important that we think about that.